Hello, lady or gentleman, all one of you who are here. Thank you very much. This is my backup channel on YouTube. Thank you for tuning in. I'm going to make it worth your while. It's whether I'm playing to a crowd of one or a crowd of 1,500. I give my all, and you will be amply rewarded. For one, you will get some insight into what Aldous Huxley was like as just a normal, average, everyday Joe, if a genius could be considered to be average. But he liked to party, and he was very amusing. He was just an old, an old boy. And I mean, apart from the fact that he was a globalist and a New World Order prophet, he was a human being, a flesh and blood human being. And I'm going to be talking about these human beings today in this session that I have titled The Cultural Origins of the Great Reset. And it's not as dry of an experience as you might imagine. In fact, these people who are responsible for what Dr. Klaus Schwab has announced as the Great Reset were just full of life, a joie de vivre, right? They just love nature and disporting themselves in the nude, even in the winter times. They like to consider themselves hardy nature people, and they like good food and furnishings, and they like the sensual life. And I think you'll be quite surprised by their culture. And by they, I'll name some of these individuals. Many of these people are, like Aldous Huxley, are very well known to us, but we don't really get an insight into who they were as human beings. And I think it's important because we will see that the vision that these people shared might not have been really that far off for what we aspire to. The chief point of departure is that their insights were taken over, they were hijacked wholesale by the technocratic elite. And these were the obverse side, the reverse side of the Bohemian people. These were the technocrats. And I know that's a little simplistic, Bohemian versus technocrat. But humor me for now, just to use that dialectic, right? And that, ladies and gentlemen, or lady and gentlemen, since there's one of you out there, thank you very much for your loyalty, and I appreciate it. That's why I asked, who's there? Oh, it's Tyron. Yes, hi, Tyron. Yeah, I got taken down on the previous channel because I went in a little bit too close to the fire. So thank you and hey, Piper Vogel, thank you very much. You found that I made the wrong date. I'm glad you're here, and I hope you'll be here tomorrow. Not here, but on Zoom. I sent the invitation for our conversation on in the afternoon, 12 o'clock. But I will also let you know, I think you might have already heard about it, but I'll be debuting a new show on the Blackberry Road Show tomorrow, Pacific time, 6 o'clock, Eastern time, 9 p.m., and I guess it's 8 p.m. in the Central time where the show is being produced. So I set this up already with Aaron Adler, and he's talked to Andy DeBala, and they're going to be helping there. And we're also planning on doing a more produced show like this, back to my original channel, Professor Hamamoto. Maybe it'll be a different title, but it'll be more produced, and I'm going to be bringing on people, authors, for example, not necessarily this one, but people of the stature of a David Icke, and you'll get an insight into who these great researchers and writers are as people. And I love interviewing individuals. I like taking phone calls. I like giving these talks as well. I mean, I was a professional lecturer for over 30 years, so it's it comes quite natural to me to be speaking into a computer camera. So anyway, Wednesday is going to be a big day, so I hope you'll join us tomorrow. And of course, I can't forget, the Monday morning, I do the second hour with George Webb, and I'm going to be asking him, just to give you a sort of a preview, a little bit more about the David Icke interview that he had. It was incredible. I think it was a real breakthrough for not just for George Webb, the reporter, the journalist, and it's obvious that David Icke considers him a peer. They're on an equal level, on an equal footing. And but it's also a breakthrough for Blackberry Roadshow. And it's only, I think it's great timing that I'll be stepping it up a notch tomorrow myself. And I will make a bid to do a return interview. This is the first time I've uttered to anybody, Tyrone Piper, you're it. But I'm going to suggest to Aaron and to George that I do a follow-up interview with David Icke to talk more about the personal aspects of his life. I mean, and the reason is that Piper, Tyrone, myself, probably you have seen David Icke more than once. Maybe you have seen him for years. You've been following his work for years. So we know his backstory. For new people, it's important for them to understand his 30-year history. But for those of us who have been following his work, we're not getting a lot of new information from David Icke. Part of it might be strategic. He's been hit pretty hard because of his visibility in the alternative scene, to the point where he's no longer the misunderstood David Icke. He's becoming sort of the well understood David Icke. I won't say he's mainstream because his approach is always that of the outsider, which I'll speak to in a moment. And that's really the idea behind Bohemianism. I think David Icke represents that, the best qualities of the Bohemian mindset. It's an approach to life. It's an outlook, and it's a position of not caring and not wanting to join the establishment, whatever it might be, in whatever age. You're standing in a critical relationship to the powers that be, and that requires an incredible confidence in your own skill, your own genius, if you will, your own learning, your own athletic ability in his case, and your own sense of self. That's really, if I could define what Bohemianism is and the way I'm using it, that's what I find most admirable about it. Now, there are some aspects of Bohemianism that cause it to auto-destruct. And in looking at the Bohemians of the interwar, the pre-war, I mean World War II period, and looking at their lives, perhaps we can avert the same pitfalls. We can avoid the same pitfalls that they fell into. In the same way that we could learn from the experiments of the hippies, so-called, in the 1960s, we might be able to avert their co-optation, their disaster. And I'm also studying these people who are out in the streets, and they're typically made fun of in the so-called independent media. They're called libtards, and they're mocked, and they make fun of them until it was finally these people who were into mockery and name calling realized that they were having an impact, and so they pulled in on that, which is good. I always took them dead seriously. I always thought Antifa and Black Lives Matter are more than just a matter of identity politics and LARPing and just acting out or being soy boys, whatever was put on them. I took them as a serious set of organizations that were engineered in order to bring down the republic, and they've almost achieved their task. So all those years that people on the Alex Jones show and these other related wannabe type shows, all that energy that was expended in making fun and mocking, it came back to haunt you, didn't it? Right. Same with the Chi-Com. You can talk about Chi-Com day in, day night. And in the meantime, we have our own domestic situation here of these laboratories and workshops of the devil that will come back to haunt the American people. So this is why, again, you and me, the three of us, oh, there's four now. Michael, Charlie, welcome. Hello. the five of us, this is why we have to maintain the Bohemian mindset. Forget the guerrilla mindset. What was that guy, Mike Cernovich? Whatever happened to Mike Cernovich? All these sort of guys that kind of came, once the neocon and the Trump revolution, if it was real or not, I won't really, say at this point, because supposedly he's going to be running for the presidency. It might be another psyop. Who knows? But yeah, you had these people like Mike Cernovich and Shapiro he managed to parlay that into a job, Dan Bongino. So it created a great deal of opportunity for Ali Akbar. I think, Ali Alexander, I think you're finished unless you can change your name for a third time. Maybe you can come back as an Indian, a South Asian, because there are dark-skinned South Asians as well as dark-skinned Arabs. Who try to pass for African American. So maybe you can call yourself Ali Khan. How's that? Ali Khan. It's your namesake. There you go. So that's not Bohemianism. That's fake Bohemianism. That's fake opposition. And you call them posers or LARPers or whatever the term is, they're perpetrators. So I'm going to talk about the Bohemian group, a distinct group, and try to learn from that. And again, I'll say that this talk here has a really good, it's a good compliment to David Icke's comments yesterday, his explanation of his progress, because like him, I also come from the working class. I come from working class origins from my father, even though my father had a college degree and all that, because of his racial identity. Right after World War II, there weren't a lot of jobs for people like him. And in a similar situation, David Icke comes out of the council housing. That is, he's working class. This is like what we call the projects in America. It's for the underclass. And I mention that because part of the Bohemian set, who I'll talk about in a moment, I promise you, they were responsible for some substantial improvements in British society. So while I am going in on them, perhaps in a way that may seem negative, I also have to recognize the fact that their program was to a certain extent pro-human. Only a certain faction within them, such as Aldous Huxley, who I'll lump in there within the Bohemians, only a certain faction within them were committed transhumanists or post-humanists or New World Order types. Most of them were against order of any sort, New World Order or other sides, or otherwise. But like the hippies, like the counterculture in the 60s, the musicians, the people who were experimenting with hallucinogens and new lifestyles and communal organizations and farming and organics and veganism, their innovations were co-opted and taken in by the New World Order handlers, who were military class at bottom. And they were used and brought back in order to fool the rest of the population to thinking this was something positive, that this was something that we should aspire to. So we have to be very careful. There's a double, triple, quadruple game that's being played here. And that's why I think our discussion here is important. So David Icke, you're a working class person. So am I. I feel you. I understand why you were, for a short time, the spokesman for the Green Party, and our, representative of the Green Party here in the U.S. We know him as Bernie Sanders out of Vermont. He was, from New York. There was a bunch of people from New York who moved up into the Northeast, into the smaller parts of the traditionally, historically conservative, bedrock Americana conservative, in order to take their political apparatus over. That was the Bernie Sanders revolution. That having been said, I have been for I can't remember how long. I've been registered in the state of California as a Green Party member, not because I agree with the Greens. I agree with multi-party democracy, and I don't like the Republicans and I don't like the Democrats either. I'm not the white shoe, right? Remember that term as it was defined, the white shoe Republicans? And I don't like the John Birch Republicans either. And I don't like the welfare state Democrats. So, I'm a man without a party. I guess I'm a Bohemian. But I do, unlike David, I believe that the electoral system and political parties do have an important role to play in the practical application of human awareness and human consciousness. I know he's all about spirit and consciousness, but we also have to get in and deal with the levers of actual political power. It really matters, especially at the local level. If you can attend the school board meetings or the city hall, or even in your little community organization. Like I belong to a homeowners association, and you go to these and you meet your neighbors. And you not only can take care of what's happening locally, but you can also have conversations about the larger world, situation. When you're at the mailbox, you run into your neighbors. So I still am a staunch advocate of political involvement, civic involvement, not in the cliched way, not in the calculated, engineered fashion that we're being taught to adore, but in the organic fashion. So let me move into the Bohemian people, the culture themselves. And a lot of it has resonance today, especially I'll give you a really good example. Why not just start GLBTQ politics? Do you think that started just 5, 6, 7 years ago, 10 years ago even? Do you think it just started in the 1960s with gay liberation, then lesbian liberation? No, ladies and gentlemen. If you've heard some of my previous talks, I've mentioned time and time again about certain elite groups within British society and German society in particular, and to a certain extent French society. I talked about Michel Foucault, who's a contemporary, who came after the Bohemians, but even he had predecessors. Now, this idea of sexual liberation and gay and lesbian transsexualism hadn't been physically possible at this juncture. That only came into play, I think, in the 40s and 50s, when surgical techniques were developed for male to female, female to male transsexual operations. But the idea of homosexual freedom and gay liberation really took hold within the English Bohemian subculture, right? And then again, what was their particular set of interests was taken by the power elite and then pushed forward as a political agenda and compulsory agenda, as we're seeing today in 2021. Now, you may know that we live in a welfare state, and I'm not going to even attempt to define that, but it's part capitalist and part socialist, right? All the big operations like the Postal Service and the interstate highway system, that's socialist. I mean, we pay federal gas taxes, local taxes. We pay into the system at the store. We pay in, through sales tax. We pay in the system for the common good, right? It helps keep the roads repaired. And if you've been outside of the country, you can see that in some countries where they have zero tax base, the infrastructure, as it's called here, is not that good. So that's the socialist part. And that might even be the good part. That might be the true, small case green part of it. Taking care of the parks and the common areas and the national park system, which is, relatively good. Up to now, I think they meaning the globalists, might be wanting to choke that off, the people who are in charge of the United Nations. We'll see how far they've captured the National Park Service. But the last time I was there, it was great. It was cheap. The people there were cool, and I hadn't really explored it that much until recently. But I've always had a good experience. So that's, if you really want to be honest about it, that's socialism in action. Because in times past, that land would have been off limits. It would have been owned by some lord, some feudal lord, right? So that's the socialist part. The capitalist part, is under attack, and that's the mom and pop businesses, right? That's really the cornerstone of the American form of self-government, and that's why it's being, you know this, but I'm just reviewing it again. That's why we can't go to our favorite cafe or restaurant. We've been locked down, and I've been supporting him as much possible. Moral support. Put my limited funds there. I'll probably go to eat at one of my favorite family-run restaurants. Don't go to chains. I go to the family-run restaurants that have been limping along for the past over a year now, and that's the capitalism that you and I want to see preserved. The Chinese restaurants, the Thai restaurant, the ethnic, the pizza shops that are not Papa John's, or Domino's. And that's true for the the non-chain shoe repair places, right? Anything that's not listed on the Fortune 500, I want to patronize them, right? So one of the godfathers of this mixed economy, part socialist and part capitalist, what we know as the welfare state, his name is John Maynard Keynes. Now, there's not going to be a quiz after this. You don't have to remember his name, but just know that one of the main figures that all your Ivy League, your elite universities, they know the name of John Maynard Keynes, and they've taught their students Keynesian economics for generation after generation. And I'm simplifying here because I know there are some economists that are strictly committed to Marxian economics, analytic Marxism. Some people take the more there's the Schiller Institute. Some of them look at the work of the American homegrown. I think he's an autodidact economist, Murray Rothbard, and on and on and on. But John Maynard Keynes, let's just focus on him for a moment, since his name is such an important touchstone to all these areas, and he's a touchstone. Whether we know his name or not, his ideas impinge upon our lives day to day, and that's really what I'm driving at right here. Now, it might be interesting for you to know, and I think there's a practical outcome of his sexual identity that we're still living with, right? Because we talked about sexual freedom as part of the Bohemians, and Maynard Keynes was part of it, even though he was not necessarily a literary Bohemian, but he was an economist. But he very much shared this ethic of sexual freedom, which included pansexuality. In his case, in his younger years, he was strictly homosexual. He liked boys. He liked men in particular, older on. And then he got married, according to this, to a Russian ballerina. And whether she was his beard or not, or he was her beard, who knows? But supposedly he became heterosexual. That doesn't really mean anything to me. What means something to me is the fact that his whole economic system, his welfare system, might have been predicated on the fact that he's going to have no progeny. He has no children to worry about. He doesn't care. I mean, his existence is terminated. It ends with him and his wife and whoever's around him. And I'm stating that as an empirical reality, not as some anti-GLBTQ slur, because this person by the name of Neil Ferguson, or Niall Ferguson, however you'd like to pronounce it. And by the way, it was the same Neil Ferguson who was responsible for orchestrating the pandemic in Britain, same guy. But he was chastised for criticizing John Maynard Keynes for his short-sighted economic vision, because he didn't care about future generations. He wasn't saying that from the perspective of him being gay. And Niall Ferguson is not gay, by the way. He was busted because even though he was advocating his fellow British subjects to shelter in place or stay at home and just be scared because of his fallacious statistical model that he came up with. He was sneaking around visiting his girlfriend. At least that's the way the story. So he's not gay himself, for whatever that's worth. But he was criticized by the GLBTQ lobby for stating what I just did. And I'll hew to that. I think the fact that John Maynard Keynes was not going to have any progeny loomed large in the fact that he advocated deficit spending, so that the bills, the liabilities through inflation, printing more money, basic economy, and all this investment and social security, or as they call it in Britain, benefits, right? That's all part of this deficit spending welfare state economy. And we know that there will be a day of reckoning. It might happen, tomorrow. You and me, we might see whatever money we have in the bank account, or in my case, my so-called Social Security, we might see it evaporate, right? Because of this unsustainable model that John Maynard Keynes helped put in place. And that's the boho. I'm saying boho, short for Bohemian. And boho is usually a term of disparagement. But as you know, I have a sentimental spot in my heart for the boho, so I'll call them bohos. But their whole deal is live for today. For tomorrow we may die. Unfortunately, humankind and human civilization, human society, has an incredible knack for rebuilding itself, no matter what. Even in the wake of atomic attacks, atomic warfare, or biological warfare. In the case of the Vietnamese people, for example, 2 million Vietnamese people were exterminated, civilians. Yet, if you go to Vietnam, now, you'll see some of the remnants of war, but even in the psychology amongst the young people, it's almost been forgotten, even though it certainly was a big feature of my life and growing up. So human beings have resilience. So we do have to think for the future. We do have to think transgenerationally, not just for our own children, but grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren, and everybody else's grandchildren, not just ourselves. We are a larger society, right? Composed of families, multiple families. And what do you think has been under attack for the past 40 years? Under the guise of, GLBTQ politics, the family. And you already know where that's going. It's going into the post-human realm. If you saw the George Webb show today, Blackberry Road Show, it was devoted to my contribution is we're being attacked by inorganic entities. Well, and this is something that a good friend of mine has been talking about for quite a while. David Icke, she in fact turned David Icke to this possibility. This is Lena Poo, who's mentioned in his book, The Answer, David Icke. And now it's come full circle. Now George Webb has been tipped off that maybe Charles Lieber is being sort of swept up at this attack on his Harvard laboratory, is really what we're looking at. We're looking at inorganic matter, not quote unquote viruses such that might be responsible for this current crisis that we're facing, right? That comes from thinking this is the Bohemian method, right? This is the Bohemian way of life, is not to rule out anything and not to name call and make fun of people just because they like to walk around in the forest naked or wear flowers in their head and wear, loose fitting clothing. I was part of the Bohemian uniform, by the way, back in 1912, up until the war. World War I made them get very seriously, and some of them died in war. Reality became very real to them very quickly. Anyway, John Maynard Keynes. Let me go to my notes on Keynes that goes back till 2016, where I wrote a piece on based on the findings of a literary scholar. Let me cite him. I'm not, my ability is finding this information, ferreting it out, so to speak, and combining it with existing information. But there's a literary scholar by the name of Paul Levy, Levy. And Paul Levy found a treasure trove of letters written by a person by the name of Lytton Strachey. He's one of those Bohemians, right? This is the book that I'm referring to, Among the Bohemians, written by the granddaughter of one of the great Bohemians of all time, Virginia Woolf. I think she was that was her aunt or great aunt. But Linda Strachey was a child of Bohemia. Didn't have a college degree, didn't need one. Their education was spotty at best, but these people were highly self-educated. Anyway, this literary scholar, Paul Levy, found letters written by Lytton Strachey to one of his friends by the name of Roger Senhouse. And this is around the late 20s and the early 30s. This is after World War I and before World War II. It's called the interwar period. And it seems that the so-called Cambridge apostles, those are the people that come out of Cambridge University, were heavily involved in, and John Maynard Keynes was a Cambridge apostle, I should add. But all these people that were part of this larger network of Bohemians or Bohos were heavily involved in sadomasochistic sexuality. And if you've watched some of my previous talks, I've delved into our friend Michel Foucault and his SM predilections that he brought to Berkeley and brought to the United States, really. But he would do these yearly talks at UC Berkeley. And so he can go hang out in San Francisco and engage in power exchange, sadomasochistic activity, right? So this seems to be a predilection amongst the educated New World Order types, of which the Bloomsbury people are, whether they like to be considered as such. I view them as being part of the New World Order complex, the deep state, because that's the culture. The culture of Podesta and Jeffrey Epstein. There's a direct line that connects them and Maria Abramovich. You know all those people. There's a direct line that connects those people with these Bohemian types, the Cambridge apostles, the sadomasochism of John Maynard Keynes, who's the godfather of the welfare state, right? Welfare, maybe sadomasochism, and I'm just thinking aloud, maybe sadomasochism is inextricably linked to the whole welfare state economic mindset or the behavior. Think about it. As a person who lives in the welfare state, you and me, Piper Vogel, Tyrone Sargent, are you still with me, sleeper hold? I hope you haven't tuned out. If you're here, raise your hand. You and me, we're in the welfare state, right? We are completely dependent upon the good graces of the federal government, the state government, right? We're going to depend on the good faith and credit of the American government that your money that says "in God we trust" is going to be worth $1. If you are a retired person or if you're a young person who is receiving survivor's benefits, you're under complete domination of a political economic system that's out of your control. You can't even go out and grow something to eat. To take care of yourself in the welfare state, right? It's locked down, right? So that's a masochistic relationship. In that sense, we might be masochists. In their case, some of these officious types at all levels of government, we've all seen them, right? Even at the vice presidential level, the best representative of that you and I know is Kamala Harris. So that's the sadistic part of the sadomasochistic dynamic. And hi, Piper, you're here. Do you like my analogy about our system being sadomasochistic in addition to being welfare state? Yeah. And we have people both who are in the Republican and Democratic Party who love being in that sadomasochistic power dynamic. I don't want to be a sadist and I don't want to be a masochist. I just want to be left the hell alone. I want to be a true Bohemian. I want to go out and raise my, I know it sounds utopian, but to a certain degree, it's still possible in America. And it's still, the jury is still out, so to speak, to see whether we're going to fall fully into their system, their sadomasochistic system, or whether we're going to win back the few remaining freedoms and liberties that we managed to preserve all these years. So anyway, let me return to John Maynard Keynes' sexuality, right? Sadomasochism, the father of the welfare state. But who were some of his cohorts? Now, I won't say they were sadomasochists or into kinky sex. Maybe they were. If you read their that's why I'm such a biography. And I like to find out who, the sexuality of these people. Call it voyeurism. I don't know. But I think for me, a person's sexuality and their sexual behavior, their patterns of sexual behavior, tells me a lot about who they are and their ideas, their intellectual output. Even someone like Anthony Bourdain, and I'm going to give a talk about Bourdain fairly soon. Not yet. I realized he's written a lot of books. It was just the first one that was a bestseller. This one, which I'm reading. But in addition to that, he's written about 4 or 5 other nonfiction books, and he's written 3 pieces of fiction. So I think I need to read more of his work. But I'm going to be talking about him and Asia Argento and her father, who was a Gothic science or horror director, Dario Argento. And to make it quick, I think he was killed, Anthony Bourdain. But reading about him and his sexual exploits, kind of tells him about what he's about. He's a sensualist. He was into drugs. He was into eating. He was into exploring. But he was a compassionate human being, and I think that's what got him killed. Anyway, I don't want to go into our contemporary Bohemian hero who died not long ago. So these strains, these cultural strains, remain with us because the bohos were very much into eating and eating well. So was Anthony Bourdain. They didn't have television though, so they weren't able to become stars like Anthony Bourdain. So you had people like, maybe these names don't mean anything to you, Leonard Woolf and Virginia Woolf, Ludwig Wittgenstein, Bertrand Russell, right? He was agnostic. He was also anti-nuclear too, at least on paper. And on and on. And Freud, although he was not a Bloomsbury, he was living in exile in London for the latter part of his life. And these boho types took up Freudian ideas with glee, with relish, and part of their ideas about child rearing, let them run around naked and unschooled and undisciplined, owed to these notions that Freud had put out there. Although they misread Freud. Freud is all about repression. He wrote he's either this long essay or a short monograph called Civilization and Its Discontents. And he was really the way I read it is that he was saying that unless you do clamp down on these unbridled sexual energies, they're going to come back and bite you on the arse, whether they be fascist, totalitarian, political movements, or you're going to internalize it and come up with all kinds of, you call it hysteria, but let's call it psychosomatic problems. So, Freud was in the air. And I should mention the fact, because one of the questions that I have always wondered about, and this is a question that I'll ask David Icke, since he comes from a working class background himself, is that why do rich people, and I have nothing against rich people, people who made their money, they had a family business and they built it up, and, sure, they might have cut corners here and there, but they're not inherited wealth. They're not trust fund babies, okay? And some trust fund babies are cool. They're so wealthy, they don't even care about money. They don't have to worry. They can actually do good works, right? Because they're taken care of. A prime example, and I respect him, ultimately, and I respect his family. A good example of that is Robert F. Kennedy Jr., right? I mean, he's a trust fund baby in the disparaging term, but his family wealth allows him to do, and you may disagree on some of his program, but for the most part, him and his family are on our side so far as I can. I thought it was really unfair that Dr. Shiva was taking these cheap shots at Robert Kennedy Jr. Anyway, that's a side issue. So these individuals have inherited wealth, have always kind of amazed me because I was around them in the academic world, and I traveled in left circles. I'm a registered Green, And part of it was because my politics. I went to these conferences that featured leftists. I went to a conference in Amherst called Rethinking Marxism. I've seen some of the major figures of this school, and I read the literature. I studied with them in the doctoral program. There weren't any at Bowling Green that I could see, not in my department. By the time I got to the PhD level, it's all almost exclusively left Marxist, right? And you know that today because they won. Generationally, they took over because their humanistic Marxism, if you want to call it that, was taken over by the racist Marxists and the power tripping Marxists that we see there. And part of this question was answered for me. And the question is, why do rich people, why are they Marxists? Because I'm not, like I said, I met in my own little conferences and my own teaching and my own profession. I met a lot of very, very wealthy people who were for revolution. They were for political revolution. They were stone cold Marxists. Some of them were even declared themselves to be revolutionary Maoists, and they were trust fund babies, and they gave money liberally to left-wing causes. And I finally figured it out. And this is a question I'll put to David Icke. It took me, it's so obvious now that I know. It's because they were set up by their families to go into left-wing politics so that they can kind of control the revolution. The best way to prevent a revolution is to control a revolution. So they were really preserving family wealth in the guise of political economic radicalism. And you could say the same is true for Lytton Strachey, right? There's this huge giant biography of him, which I just got the other day. It's a doorstop, and other people like Maynard Keynes and Virginia Woolf and one of their acquaintances, Aldous Huxley, and people like Bertrand Russell, is that they could and George Bernard Shaw, the great Irish playwright, right? He was a leftist. He was a Marxist. I guess I don't know if he'd call himself a Marxist, but I view him as part of that British Marxian tradition. They were there to preserve their own class interests against the super hereditary wealth and against royalty, I guess. But they weren't necessarily for the working man. They were using the working class as a device, as a rhetorical device for their revolution, just like Joe Biden or Kamala Harris or all those people in the Democratic and the Republican Party use the name of Black people, Latinos. They never talk about Asians, of course, because we are the servitors of their world. At least they want to think so. They don't have us, and not all of us, in the bag yet. And they want to say that we're for the people, right? It's the same way with the Boho people, because most of them, even though they adored what they called then gypsies, are called Romas today, and all their little appurtenances, their dress, and they affected their mannerism and their carefree joie de vivre, as they call it in French. It was about their own class prelude when you want to get down to it. But I don't think they didn't have the Bohemian types we're talking about. I don't think they had the mean-spiritedness as the technocrats have today, right? The technocrats of today, and again, remember at the beginning of the talk, I put in opposition the Bohemians versus the technocrats, simplistic as it is. The technocrats have zero heart. The bohos had a huge heart. They were in love with humanity. They love the arts. They love music. They love dance. They love Nijinsky. They love everything expressive and human and joyous about social life and cultural life. And gosh, if we could only get back to I'm romanticizing it like everybody does who's interested in the Bloomsbury group, right? I'm not going to fall in that trap, but it's quite it's so romantic, right? Compare that with the cold-hearted technocrats, right? Who want to obliterate that altogether. So that's all for John Maynard Keynes. He was totally into sodomy. He was into brutal sex. I'd like to beat up young boys and young men in particular. That was his kick, and that was and they were usually what they call trade. They were working class lads, right? That they picked up, skulking about, right? Some of them really got off on that type of power relationship. Let me move on from there. I'm talking a little bit too much about their sexual predilections. But before that, let me share with you something else about sodomy, right? Because if you've heard me in other contexts, and let's say George's show and John's, and in my own talks, I've talked about the twin rails of buggery and bastardy as being three areas of civilizational discontent that are always being contended upon. The illegitimate ones are always looking for legitimacy, and they're always looking to overthrow the powers that be, the legitimate non-bastard sign. And the buggery ones are people like John Maynard Keynes, and they're usually, not usually, but typically illegitimate. But buggery is really, I came to this conclusion not long, maybe 5 years ago. Buggery is really a practical response to the Victorian era of long distance merchant seamen and travel, no pun on words, and trade. And it's buggery is also very practical for men at sea and for warriors, colonial types, right? And in other words, sailors, which I've explained before, have a tradition of buggery, buggery in the high seas. We have, what's her name, Kathy Griggs, who has given a talk on that talks about the U.S. Marines and military. That's all transgenerational, and it has its origins in imperialism, in empire building buggery. And this is, again, reinforced in my mind by a book that I came across recently titled Sodomy and the Pirate Tradition. What a great title. Not that I'm either for sodomy or piracy, but it encapsulates this relationship between empire building, imperialism, and a certain type of sexual expression, sodomy. Male sodomy, right? Sodomy in the pirate tradition. English sea rovers in the 17th century Caribbean, right? There you go. And this is one of the reasons why the nobility and the upper middle class in British society sent their young boys off to public school, where they would be at a very early age subjected to brutal treatment and oftentimes were sodomized by older boys, bigger, larger, older, in addition to some of the schoolmasters, right? In fact, one of the people that Anthony Bourdain really says is the architect of what's called California cuisine, Nouvelle cuisine. What's in Jeremiah Tower? He talks about Tower here. Tower has a documentary, a biography talking about his upper middle class American family sending him to a British public school where he was buggered routinely, and he, as a result, his sexuality was predicated upon male sex. I don't know if buggery was part of it. Anyway, it becomes multi-generational. But my contribution here is to saying the buggery and the bastardy begins with this original New World Order concept that's called imperialism, right? This is where Britain and the great European powers, including even before Britain, Portugal and Spain, this is where they went overseas to capture the rest of the known world. And of course, part of that worldview was refined to the point that we are going to exert control over the entire world and its entire population through technocratic means. And that's why such incredible resources were poured into matters of political economics. That's why people like John Maynard Keynes were pushed forward to Cambridge University to study the great political economists of the past, from David Ricardo, who is an Englishman, and Karl Marx, who he owes a great debt to. I'm talking about John Maynard Keynes, to study them so they can know how to organize and structure the New World Order. So John Maynard Keynes is even though he's long dead, he's very much part of this history that we're talking about. This is part of the cultural origins of the Great Reset, right? John Maynard Keynes there's a direct line that connects him with Klaus Schwab. And I bet if we looked into Klaus Schwab's sexuality, his predilections, we would come up to some astounding findings. So I'll leave it to Piper Vogel, Tyrone Sargent, David, Jimmy, all of you in the chat room. I want you to find out what Klaus Schwab's kinks are. I think we got a little hint of it by the fact, and this is what Aaron Adler or Andy Dabala found this photograph of Klaus Schwab wearing this sort of Star Trek, revisited. What is it? The Next Generation? What is it called? Star Trek Generation 9? What is it called? By the way, that's a reference to the Group of Nine, which is an occult group. Gene Roddenberry was part of it. He wears that uniform. So I think he's probably into Klaus Schwab. He's probably into some sort of fantasy trip of intergalactic alien sex, alien love child. There's a great instrumental album by it's a group. They named their group Alien Love Child. This is Eric Johnson. This is one of his side groups. I think it was called Alien Love Child. So check Schwab out. I'm really want to find out. It's going to start appearing once it's time for him to be moved out, because they keep rolling out new ones, right? We're going to find all we ever wanted to know about Klaus Schwab's sexuality. It's already been bandied about that he's probably the bastard. There we go, the bastard theme again. He's probably the bastard son of a Jewish mother with a German Third Reich, probably in the officer corps, father. Right. And because of that sexual dynamic, maybe, he wants to inflict punishment on the rest of the world. He realizes that because of his bastardy, he's just by definition of his existence, he'll never be accepted into the group that he's so willing to kill for. Right. So these sexual dynamic, and Freud was right about this. I don't agree with Freud's critique in general, but Freud is correct that you have to understand the child. You have to understand the biography. That was his formulation, right? Child is the father to the man. Freud was great at coming up with these epigrams. Child is the father to the man. Child is the mother to the woman. Whatever it is, the child gives rise to the adult, right? And is the parent of that adult. And so the child's experiences go into who that person is an adult. So let's dig in on Klaus. I wasn't intending to put this research agenda up front to you, but that's why I like to do these live streams. I come up in the midstream with new possibilities here. So we're going to go in on Klaus Schwab and deal with what his fixation is with being a star trooper is all about, right? He's into cosplay, in Japan, Japanese popular culture, cosplay. Yeah, he's doing that, and he's doing it in public. Okay. Check out, because I'm running out of time here, I got to start concluding. Check out this book here, Among the Bohemians. I learned something about the original Frankenstein movie, 1931, directed by James Whale, and the follow-up, which is oftentimes amongst film critics and the audience, is seen as one of the best sequels ever to an exist. People love Frankenstein even now, right? The original one with Boris Karloff as the Frankenstein. He wasn't called, the monster's not called Frankenstein, Dr. Frankenstein. He was just called the monster. So I'm just saying the Frankenstein monsters. Boris Karloff, right? 31. But the sequel to that was The Bride of Frankenstein. And that's where Dr. Frankenstein created a female companion for his monster, played by Boris Karloff. And I found out in this book that the woman who played that, her name is Elsa Lanchester. I always thought she was just a character actress, but I knew she had some theatrical experience in London, but I didn't know that she was part of that Bohemian set. You remember her? You've seen scenes and pictures of her from The Bride of Frankenstein. She's the woman with the hair that stands up. It's all electrified, and she's got these gray streaks on the side, and she looks like she's a reanimated corpse, which is what she is, right? The Bride of Frankenstein. She was one of these bohos. That's one of the pieces of cultural history, or you might call it trivia, that I came across here. Now, I'm sorry, I promised to move away from the sexual dimension of this discussion, but I hate to sound reductionist like Freud, but I think a lot of it does come back down to the sexuality dimension of human life. After all, without sexuality, we would not be here, right? But I learned from this boho book that there was a certain Dr. Grafenberg. It's Graf with the umlaut on the A, Grafenberg. Dr. Grafenberg, who was the person, this preceded Margaret Sanger, right? These people, the bohos, kind of made it possible for an Edith Sanger to find a receptive, no pun intended, audience for her eugenics work, right? You had to have gone through the Bohemian phase first. But Margaret Sanger, who invented birth control, it was a Viennese, I guess, or maybe German doctor by the name of Grafenberg. He devised the female birth control device there. But we know him many years later as having identified a certain pleasure zone in the female anatomy that we know today as the G-spot. There you go. Look at, you had to spend a whole 60 minutes to finally get to the money shot, so to speak, right? The G-spot was very much a Bohemian. It wasn't discovered in the 60s or 70s. These people knew about it, and they enjoyed their sexuality for the sake of sexuality. The hippies came at it far differently. The reason I keep mentioning the hippies in the 60s is because there's so much abuse heaped upon Jim Morrison and the Doors and the Beatles, and there's Tavistock this and Tavistock that, and all the indie research seems to point to one particular single constellation, right, that centers upon the work of John Coleman, who was, by the way, was former, quote unquote, former MI6, right? And I think that's a way to discredit the whole counterculture. And of course, Coleman included, neglect the 1910s, 15 up to the World War I period, the true source of New World Order power, the true cultural origins of the Great Reset, by putting it off on my generation, right? It was not my generation. It was my grandparents' generation, who were the swingers and the hippies and the people who were into back to nature and into environmentalism. Because you know what, ladies and gentlemen, that's where the power rests today, right? So now I figured out why there's a 1960s psyop on the 1960s psyop. Anyway, I'll return to that over and over again. I won't go into, because you've heard me talk about V.C. Andrews and Gothic literature, and you've heard me talk about incest. Well, there was this one guy, I'll conclude. Well, I don't want to conclude here. I'll leave this for later, perhaps. But one of the people that were instrumental in this group, his name is Eric Gill, G-I-L, his sculpture. But he perpetrated incest on not one, not two, but all three of his daughters. And this author makes the claim, and it's something that I will dispute. she claims that that this was innocent experimentation on the part of Eric Gill, this incestuous father, if you could call him that. And I'll quote from Virginia Nicholson, right? Remember, her family comes from this circle, so you got to wonder about her family's sexuality too, and their sexual values. His capacity, we're talking about Eric Gill, his capacity for egocentric delusion on a grand scale is quite extraordinary, and yet relatively harmless. Gill's erotic art speaks of man guiltlessly in love with sheer wonder and beauty of sex and the human body. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'll leave you with this thought. One of the masterpieces of this sculpture of the boho period, Eric Gill, graces the headquarters of the British Broadcasting Corporation, I believe it's called, the BBC, anti-Beeb. And it is a picture of a godlike Solomaic man embracing it between his legs, a virginal boy, completely naked. The god, this Atlantean god, is fully garbed and bearded, whereas this boy, who's part of this Buggery sexual dynamic, it's on display at the BBC. And I mentioned this in closing because that tells you about the nature, the signal, about it really reveals through coded form, through sculptural form, what the BBC stands for. And it was revealed finally with the scandal that was publicized by, guess who? David Icke. And that's the scandal that surrounded Jimmy Savile, who was a BBC presenter, right? Had his own shows and was close to people like the Beatles, at least professionally close, right? He presented them because he was a pop impresario, or compere, as they call that, a DJ, before they were DJ. That's Jimmy Savile. That's the BBC. And that is the connection between the bohos of the period we're talking about. And that completes the circle of this talk, the cultural origins of the Great Reset. And remember, ladies and gentlemen, oh, Tyrone, you say, wow, I'm going to scan that sculpture, that pedophilic sculpture done by Eric Gill, and I'm going to post it on the patch around so you can see it. It's pretty creepy, and it really ties in everything together. And it's an homage to our friend of the Osprey Nation, friend of Blackberry Road show, friend of George Webb, and friend of you and me, David Icke, for having the courage and the insight to reveal the nature of this transgenerational network, which is still at the heart of the New World Order. Ladies and gentlemen, that's my time. Please share this. Because of the shutdown here of my channel, we haven't had a very large stream, but hopefully, given the information that I've imparted today, there'll be others that want to watch this. So please share it widely. I appreciate it. Again, thank you, Tyrone. Thank you, Piper. Thank you, David, Jimmy, if you're still here. Thank you very much for attending. We'll see you tomorrow morning. It's going to be great. All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.